the strongest warrior in our academy challenged the smallest human in front of hundreds of cadets. 12 minutes later, that same warrior was carried away on a stretcher, and everything we believed about humanity died with him. My name is Tarquil Bess, and I watched it happen from the front row. My name is Tarquil Bess, and if you had told me at the start of this semester that I would watch a human being casually dismantle a Thren warrior like he was folding laundry, I would have laughed so hard my secondary lungs would have collapsed. But here we are. Let me tell you how it happened. Because someone has to, and apparently that someone is me. I've told this story so many times now that I've started numbering the versions, and this one, my friends, is the director's cut. Sit tight. We were packed into the observation arena of the Galactic Combat Academy, an amphitheater built like a bowl, with hundreds of us crammed onto stone benches that had clearly been designed by someone who had never once considered comfort as a concept, or possibly by someone who actively hated the idea of anyone enjoying themselves while learning. The air smelled like ozone and nerves and, faintly, of whatever the cafeteria had been serving that morning, which I will not describe further out of respect for anyone eating while listening to this. Every single student around me was buzzing like a swarm of wealthy wasps because word had gotten out that today's demonstration involved the new exchange student, the human one, the one everyone had already decided was going to be a very short, very sad lesson in evolutionary biology, filed neatly under the heading of things we already knew but wanted to see confirmed on a stage. See, we had a running joke that semester. Every species has one, apparently, some unfortunate group that gets nominated as the punchline for an entire academic term. Ours was that humans were the designated punching bag of the year, the species you brought up when you wanted to make a point about how fragile some evolutionary paths turn out to be. No claws, no natural armor, no venom, no echolocation, no bioluminescent warning displays, nothing. Just soft skin and soft bones and, allegedly, a soft mind to match, wrapped in a body that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts left over after the universe finished building everyone else. So when Professor Odalis Kroon announced there would be a live combat demonstration featuring the human, half the room actually applauded. Applauded! Like we were about to watch a comedy show instead of what everyone assumed would be a very brief, very one-sided beating, the kind of thing you'd tell your hatchmates about for a week and then forget. Down in the arena floor, stretching like he already owned the place, was Kesrin Vale. Now, if you don't know what a Thren looks like, let me paint the picture for you. Take something the size of a large predator cat, add about 2 extra feet of height, layer on muscle in places that shouldn't logically need muscle that seemed to exist purely for the purpose of looking threatening in low lighting, and then give it a set of retractable bone blades along both forearms, just in case regular claws weren't intimidating enough for the marketing department. Kesrin was, by Thren standards, something of a celebrity. He had already completed 3 sanctioned hunts against lesser species during his cadet years, which is apparently a lot, and he walked into that arena like he was expecting a marching band, a parade, and possibly a small statue erected in his honor by lunchtime. He flexed for the crowd. He actually flexed, rotating slowly so everyone got a good look, like a piece of meat presenting itself at a butcher's counter. The crowd cheered like he'd already won, which, to be fair, everyone assumed he had, myself very much included. And then the doors on the other side of the arena opened, and out walked the human. His name, we would later learn, was Finch Rowan, and I want you to understand something about first impressions, because ours was catastrophically wrong in a way that should be studied in textbooks as a warning to future generations. He walked in wearing something simple, some kind of dark gray training outfit, no weapons, no armor, no dramatic entrance music, no cape, no smoke effects, nothing. Average height, not particularly muscular, not by Thren standards, not by anyone's standards really, not even by the standards of some of the smaller herbivorous species in attendance. He looked, and I say this with complete honesty, like someone who had wandered into the wrong building and was too polite to say anything about it, like he'd meant to attend a lecture on tax law and ended up here by administrative error. The laughter started almost immediately. Someone a few rows down from me, a Velkorian named Osa, laughed so hard she nearly fell off her bench, catching herself with one of her lower limbs at the last possible moment. "That's it," she said, wiping tears from 3 of her 4 eyes while the 4th one stayed fixed on the arena floor. "That's the thing we're all scared of? It looks like it would snap in half if you breathed on it too hard. I've seen decorative garden ornaments with more menacing posture." Professor Kroon stepped forward, robes billowing dramatically because apparently even academics need a costume department budget, and raised both hands for quiet. "Students," he said in that voice he used when he wanted everyone to think he was being profound, the voice that made even simple sentences sound like they belonged carved into a monument. "Today we witness an educational demonstration in comparative evolutionary combat efficiency. Cadet Kesrin Vale, representing the Thren warrior tradition, will engage in controlled combat with our human exchange student in order to illustrate the biological disparities between predator and prey species." Educational demonstration. Right. That's one word for it. I would have called it something closer to a public execution with extra steps and a permission slip, but nobody asked me, and nobody ever does, which I've made my peace with at this point. "To ensure fairness of observation," Kroon continued, "and here's where things got genuinely absurd. Absurd enough that I actually sat forward on my bench. Cadet Vale will retain use of his natural weaponry, while the human subject will remain unarmed, per the control variables necessary for this comparison." I turned to the student next to me, a nervous little Senek named Dobin, and said, "Did he just say the predator gets to keep his knife arms and the human gets nothing? That's not a control variable, that's just cheating with extra paperwork attached, so it looks official." Dobin didn't answer. Dobin was too busy hoping nobody would ask him to volunteer for the next demonstration, his skin patterns cycling through several anxious shades in rapid succession. Down in the stands, closer to the arena floor, I noticed Nirel Sask, a younger student who I didn't know well, leaning forward with an expression that wasn't laughing along with everyone else. She looked uncomfortable, arms folded tight against her chest. I remember thinking, at the time, that she was just squeamish, that she'd grow out of it. Turns out she was the only one in that entire arena with functioning instincts, and the rest of us were the ones who needed growing up to do. Kesrin began circling Finch immediately, tail flicking, doing that low predatory prowl that Thren warriors practice specifically because it looks impressive on camera, the kind of walk that's clearly been rehearsed in a mirror at some point, probably several points. He said something in his native growl speech, low and rumbling, and the translation orb overhead rendered it in flat, toneless galactic common. "Small thing, I have hunted 11 species softer than you. You will make number 12, and you will not even be memorable." The crowd roared with laughter at that because Thren insults always translate a little clumsy, a little too literal, and there's something inherently funny about a 7-foot predator monologuing like a cartoon villain who's read one too many scrolls about intimidation tactics. Finch just looked at him, didn't flinch, didn't posture. He tilted his head slightly, like he was considering something mildly interesting, the way you might look at a dog barking at a vacuum cleaner, and said, in a tone so dry it could have started a fire in a rainstorm, "Cool story. Do you rehearse that in a mirror, or does it just come naturally?" The translator orb, bless its malfunctioning little circuits, rendered this into something completely nonsensical in Thren dialect. Something about mirrors having childbirth, which caused half the crowd to burst into confused laughter for entirely the wrong reason. I laughed too. I'm not proud of it, but I laughed. Mostly because the confusion itself was funnier than either the joke or the insult had been. Up in the private observation box reserved for diplomatic guests, I noticed Ambassador Yuvan Holt, the human diplomat assigned to our academy, watching the whole thing with an expression that could have been carved from stone, sanded smooth, and then carved again for good measure. No fear, no concern, not even mild interest, really. Just watching, like someone waiting for a kettle to boil, fully aware it was going to boil eventually, and there wasn't much point getting excited about it in the meantime. That should have told us something. It didn't. We were too busy laughing to notice the one person in the room who wasn't. Kroon raised a hand. Demonstration will commence in 3, 2, 1. Kesrin didn't wait for 0. Of course he didn't. He lunged forward at a speed that genuinely made several students gasp, and one small creature 2 rows behind me actually squeak, forearm blades extending with a wet, mechanical click that echoed through the arena like a countdown to something inevitable. This was the moment. This was supposed to be the highlight reel, the part where the human either got flattened immediately or, if we were feeling generous with our expectations, managed to survive for maybe 4 or 5 seconds before the inevitable conclusion everyone had already written in their heads. Finch stepped sideways. That's it. That's the whole thing. He didn't dodge dramatically, didn't do a flip, didn't do anything that looked like it belonged in an action broadcast with dramatic music swelling underneath. He just shifted his weight, rotated his shoulder, and let several 100 pounds of angry predator sail past him like he was letting a rude stranger through a doorway he happened to be standing near. The crowd went quiet. Not stunned quiet, confused quiet. The kind of quiet where everyone is checking with the person next to them to make sure they saw the same thing, glancing sideways, silently asking, "Did that just happen the way I think it happened?" Kesrin recovered fast, spinning around with a snarl, and this time he adjusted his approach, coming in lower, feinting with one arm before swinging the other in a move clearly designed to catch anyone who'd fallen for the first fake. Finch actually laughed, out loud. A short, genuine laugh like Kesrin had just told an unintentionally good joke at a dinner party. "You're telegraphing," Finch said, ducking under the swing and stepping past him again, close enough that I could see Kesrin's claws miss by a margin that would have made a surgeon nervous. Like, a lot. I've seen toddlers with better follow-through, and toddlers are famously bad at hiding what they're about to do. The translator orb rendered this with a slight delay, and by the time the Thren crowd understood they were being mocked, Finch had already put 6 feet of distance between himself and Kesrin, using a support pillar to change his angle entirely, moving like he had a map of the arena memorized and Kesrin didn't. I turned to Dobin again. "Is it me?" I said. "Or is the little soft thing actually enjoying this?" Dobin, still too nervous to speak, just nodded slowly, eyes wide, his skin patterns having settled into a shade I'd never seen on him before. Something between disbelief and dawning terror. Nyrel Sask, a few rows down, had stopped covering her face. She was watching now, really watching, leaning so far forward I worried she might tip over the railing, and I could see the exact moment the laughter in her expression curdled into something closer to fascination. The specific fascination of someone realizing the ground beneath their assumptions had just shifted. Kesrin, for his part, was starting to look less like a celebrity predator and more like someone who had shown up to a fight expecting an easy paycheck and was slowly realizing the check was going to bounce badly in front of everyone he knew. He roared, actually roared, loud enough that dust shook loose from somewhere above, and charged again, this time abandoning the showmanship entirely in favor of raw aggression, blades slashing in wide arcs. Finch used the environment against him, ducking behind one of the arena's lighting rigs, letting Kesrin's claws rake sparks off metal instead of flesh, sparks that scattered across the arena floor like tiny, brief fireworks. He grabbed a loose support cable, not as a weapon exactly, more as a tool, using it to redirect Kesrin's momentum sideways into a support column with a crash that shook dust down from the arena ceiling and made half the front row flinch back in their seats. "Ow," Finch said conversationally, to no one in particular, rubbing his shoulder where a glancing blow had connected earlier. "That one actually hurt. Nice. Good for you, seriously. That's the first thing that's landed all day." He said it like he was congratulating an opponent in a card game for finally playing a decent hand, the sort of casual sportsmanship you'd expect between old friends, not between a human and a creature actively trying to kill him. Kesrin, bleeding slightly from where he'd clipped the column, stared at him with something that I can only describe as dawning horror. The specific horror of a predator realizing its prey isn't afraid of it, has perhaps never once considered being afraid of it, and finds the entire situation mildly entertaining instead. This was the moment the entire arena's collective sense of humor died. You could feel it happen, a wave moving through the stands row by row. 1 second we were an audience laughing at a mismatch. The next second we were an audience watching something we didn't fully understand and weren't sure we wanted to keep watching. And yet none of us looked away, not for a second. Kesrin dropped the theatrics completely. No more circling, no more taunts, no more growled monologues about hunting soft species across the galaxy. He went full Predator, all speed and violence, blades slashing in patterns clearly meant to overwhelm through sheer volume of attacks, a flurry that would have ended most fights in the first 3 seconds. And here's the thing, here's the part that made my stomach do something uncomfortable, something I still think about. Finch didn't dodge everything, he took hits. He let some land, absorbing blows across his forearms, his shoulder, once across his ribs hard enough that we heard the impact from the stands, a sound like a fist against a drum. And every single time, he just kept moving forward instead of back, kept closing distance instead of running, like pain was information rather than a reason to stop, like his body was simply filing each hit away for later review instead of reacting the way any sensible creature should. "He's not even trying to avoid getting hit," Nyrell said, loud enough that I heard her from several rows away. She wasn't talking to anyone in particular. She was talking to herself, working through what she was seeing in real time, piecing together a puzzle none of us had the right picture for. He's just deciding which hits are worth taking. That was, I would later learn, an extremely accurate assessment. Humans apparently have this deeply unsettling capacity to treat their own pain as a strategic resource rather than a stop sign, a concept that took me weeks to fully process and still doesn't sit entirely comfortably in my head. Finch took a solid hit across the ribs, grunted, a small, very mortal sound, and used the exact moment of contact to grab Kesrin's extended arm, twist it past its natural range, and drive an elbow into the joint hard enough that I heard something crack from 3 rows up, a sound that made the Velkorian next to me cover 2 of her eyes. Kesrin screamed. It wasn't a battle roar this time. It was pain, real pain, the kind you can't perform for an audience no matter how good an actor you are. "Yeah," Finch said, stepping back and shaking out his own arm like he was warming up rather than finishing something, entirely too casual for the situation. "That's gonna bruise for both of us, honestly. Congratulations, you're the first thing that's actually landed a decent hit on me all week." "Really? Gold star, I mean that." The crowd around me had gone from laughing to whispering to almost completely silent. And I want to be honest with you, dear listener, wherever and whenever you're hearing this, I have never in my life felt an entire room of hundreds of people simultaneously update their worldview in real time. But that is exactly what was happening around me. You could feel the assumptions falling apart, one by one, like tiles sliding off a roof during a storm, each one landing with a small, quiet crash that nobody quite wanted to acknowledge out loud. Kesrin, cradling his injured arm, made one last desperate charge, blades leading, roaring with whatever pride he had left, clearly deciding that if he was going down, he wasn't going down without one final attempt at dignity, one last chance to salvage something from this. Finch didn't even step back this time. He stepped into it, caught the extended arm at the wrist, used Kesrin's own forward momentum against him, and threw him, not dramatically, not with some kind of impressive martial flourish set to music, just efficiently, like moving a piece of furniture that was in the wrong spot and needed relocating, sending Kesrin crashing to the arena floor on his back, with a thud that seemed to echo far longer than it should have. And then Finch did something that honestly unsettled the entire academy more than any amount of violence could have. He knelt down, pinned Kesrin's uninjured arm to prevent further struggle, and simply waited. No killing blow, no gloating, no final speech delivered to the crowd with arms raised in victory. He just looked down at Kesrin, breathing steady, completely calm, and said, quiet enough that the translator orb barely caught it, quiet enough that I had to lean forward myself just to hear it clearly. "We done here? Because I've got homework, and I'd genuinely rather be doing that instead of this." Silence. Complete, total. arena-wide silence. The kind of silence that has weight to it, that presses down on your chest a little. Even Professor Kroon, standing at the edge of the arena floor with his mouth slightly open, looked like he'd forgotten how his own vocal cords worked, like someone had simply reached in and switched them off. Kesrin, defeated, humiliated, and very clearly in significant pain, simply stopped struggling. That was it. That was the fight. No blood spray, no dramatic finishing move, nothing that would have made for a good highlight reel to show visiting dignitaries. Just a predator lying on the ground, staring up at a species he had been taught to consider soft, realizing in real time exactly how wrong that assumption had been, and probably wishing very sincerely that he had chosen a different career path that morning. Up in the stands, nobody clapped. Nobody laughed. A few students actually looked physically ill, which, considering some of the anatomy in that room included creatures who regularly consumed their prey alive as a matter of routine biology, was genuinely saying something significant about what we'd just witnessed. I turned to Dobin. He had gone somewhat pale, in whatever way a Senek goes pale, which mostly involves his skin patterns dimming slightly until they're almost uniform gray. "I don't think," he said slowly, each word deliberate, "that we should make jokes about the humans anymore." "No," I agreed. "I don't think we should, ever again, possibly for the rest of our natural lives." Professor Kroon cleared his throat, straightened his robes, and attempted, valiantly and unsuccessfully, to salvage the situation with the kind of academic spin that only makes things worse the harder you try. "As we can observe," he announced, voice cracking slightly on the second word, "the human subject demonstrates an unusually high pain tolerance threshold combined with efficient tactical improvisation, which of course was precisely the educational outcome this demonstration was designed to illustrate from the outset." Somewhere behind me, a student muttered, just loud enough for those nearby to hear, "Sure, that's definitely what you were expecting when you set this up. Absolutely. You totally called that one, Professor. Well done. Gold star for you too." Kroon ignored the comment, mostly because there was nothing else he could do with it. No dignified response available anywhere in his considerable academic vocabulary. Medical staff rushed onto the arena floor to attend to Kesrin, who was helped up, arm hanging at an angle that made several students wince and one actually turn away entirely, his expression no longer that of a celebrated warrior, but of someone who had just had every assumption about his own species' superiority forcibly removed from his skull in front of an audience of several hundred witnesses, all of whom would remember this for the rest of their academic careers. Finch stood, brushed himself off, glanced briefly at the crowd like he'd just noticed we were still there, and gave a small, almost embarrassed shrug, the universal gesture of someone who wasn't entirely sure why everyone was staring at him like that, like he'd done something mildly impressive rather than something that had just rewritten an entire semester's worth of assumptions. Nirel Sask, still watching from her seat, finally spoke up loud enough for the rows around her to hear, her voice steadier now than it had been all afternoon. "We've been telling ourselves a story," she said, "about what humans are, and that story was wrong. Like, catastrophically wrong, in a way that should genuinely embarrass every single one of us who laughed earlier." Nobody argued with her, nobody had the energy to, and honestly, nobody had the grounds to either. As Finch made his way toward the arena exit, he passed close enough to the front row that his voice carried clearly. No translator delay needed this time, because apparently he'd picked up more of our language than any of us had given him credit for, which in hindsight should have been our first clue that we had underestimated him from the very beginning. He glanced at Professor Kroon, at Kesrin being carried off on a medical stretcher, at the entire stunned arena full of faces that had gone from mocking to speechless in the span of a few minutes, and said, without any drama whatsoever, like he was commenting on the weather, "For the record, this wasn't even close to the worst thing that's tried to kill me this year. You guys should meet my little sister sometime. She's scarier than all of this combined, and she's 12. And then he just walked out. No parting speech, no victory pose, no dramatic exit line delivered with a wink to an invisible camera crew. Just a guy heading toward the door like he had somewhere better to be. Which, considering what he'd said about homework, he apparently did, and none of us doubted for a second that he meant it. Up in the observation box, Ambassador Yuvan Holt rose from their seat, unhurried, expression finally shifting just slightly, the faintest ghost of a smile that somehow felt more unsettling than anything that had happened in the arena that entire afternoon. They didn't say a word to the assembled faculty, didn't offer congratulations or reassurances or diplomatic pleasantries of any kind. They simply nodded once, turned, and followed Finch out, the two of them disappearing through the corridor like this entire event had been about as remarkable to them as watching someone cross a street on a quiet afternoon. I sat there for a long moment after they left, along with everyone else, trying to process what exactly we had just witnessed, replaying it in my head, looking for the moment where it had all gone sideways and never quite finding a single clear point where things had turned. Because the truth was, it had been turning from the very first sidestep and none of us had noticed until it was far too late to unnotice it. Somewhere in that silence, I heard Dobin whisper, mostly to himself, "We really thought that species was the weak one. We really did," I said. Here's the thing nobody in that arena wanted to admit out loud, but every single one of us was thinking it as we filed out in stunned, uncomfortable silence, shuffling toward the exits without our usual post-demonstration chatter. We hadn't just watched a fight. We had watched an entire academic worldview get quietly, politely dismantled by someone who genuinely seemed more concerned about his homework than about the fact that he just humiliated one of the most feared warrior species in known space, and hadn't even bothered to look particularly proud of it afterward. Professor Kroon tried, in the days that followed, to reframe the entire demonstration as some kind of intentional pedagogical triumph, insisting in follow-up lectures, delivered with increasingly forced confidence, that this had always been about illustrating the danger of underestimating apparent physical weakness, that the outcome had been anticipated all along by minds far wiser than the average student could appreciate. Nobody believed him, even the students who wanted to believe him, the ones desperately trying to preserve some shred of the old hierarchy in their heads because the alternative was too uncomfortable to sit with, couldn't quite manage it, not after watching Kesrin get carried out on a stretcher by a species we had spent the entire semester mocking as biologically inferior, as an evolutionary afterthought, as a punchline with a pulse. Kesrin, for what it's worth, recovered from his injuries, though I heard he requested a transfer to a different combat track shortly afterward, one that didn't involve quite so much public humiliation on record. I don't blame him. I think if I'd had my entire species' reputation quietly folded up and put in a drawer by someone half my size who was more worried about homework than victory, I'd want a change of scenery too. Possibly a change of galaxy. As for the rest of us, we adjusted. Slowly, awkwardly, the way you adjust to finding out something you'd always assumed was true had actually been backwards the entire time. The way you rebuild an entire mental filing system overnight because the old one turned out to be sorted incorrectly from the start. The jokes stopped. The mockery stopped almost entirely, except from the occasional new student who hadn't been there and had to be quietly informed, usually by someone who had witnessed it firsthand, that this particular line of humor was no longer considered safe or accurate. Somewhere in the Academy's collective memory, humans went from being the punchline of the semester to being the subject everyone suddenly, urgently wanted to study properly, and not because of some dry academic curiosity either, but because of something closer to respect, mixed liberally with a very healthy dose of caution, the kind of caution you develop after touching something you were told was harmless and getting burned. Nirel Sask ended up switching her academic focus entirely, choosing to specialize in human behavioral study, something that would have been considered a joke assignment before that day and was suddenly one of the most competitive tracks in the entire academy, with a waiting list longer than anyone had ever seen for a subject nobody used to take seriously. Last I heard, she was doing quite well in her studies, mostly because she was the only one who'd had the sense to start paying attention before the rest of us had even realized there was something worth paying attention to. And me. I still tell this story every chance I get, partly because it's a genuinely good story, the kind that gets better with each retelling even without exaggeration, which is rare, and partly because I think it's important that people remember exactly how wrong an entire room full of supposedly intelligent, educated beings can be about a species they never bothered to actually understand. We had blades, we had claws, we had centuries of predatory evolution and combat tradition on our side, generations of warriors bred and trained for exactly this kind of confrontation, and none of it mattered against someone who simply refused to be afraid, refused to stop moving forward no matter how many hits landed, and apparently considered a broken rib a reasonable price of admission for winning a fight he hadn't even wanted to be in. So if you ever find yourself sitting across from a human, and you start thinking, based on soft skin and unimpressive claws and a general lack of natural weaponry, that you've got the easier fight on your hands, I want you to remember this story. Remember Kesran Vile, celebrated Thren warrior, 3 sanctioned hunts to his name, carried out on a stretcher by a guy who was more annoyed about missing his homework than concerned about the fight itself. Remember that soft skin apparently comes with a mind that doesn't know when to quit, and a tolerance for pain that borders on the genuinely alarming, wrapped around a species that somehow, against every expectation we had, turned out to be exactly the opposite of what we assumed. Remember that the class knew, right then, exactly how it would end. We just hadn't figured it out until it already had, and by then all we could do was sit in silence and rewrite everything we thought we knew. There is a small addition to this story that most people leave out when they retell it, and I only found out about it weeks later, from a maintenance worker who happened to be cleaning the arena corridors that day and saw something none of us in the stands were positioned to see. Apparently, after Finch left through the exit tunnel, he stopped for a moment near the medical bay where Kesran was being treated, arm splinted, pride considerably more damaged than the arm itself. According to the maintenance worker who had absolutely no reason to make this up and seemed almost bewildered telling it, Finch leaned against the doorway and said something to Kesran directly, without any translator delay, without any audience, without any reason to perform for anyone at all. He apparently told Kesran that he fought well, that the arm lock only worked because Kesran had committed fully to the charge instead of holding something back, and that most people when they're losing start holding back out of instinct, which usually makes things worse, not better. He said Kesran's mistake wasn't weakness, it was inexperience against something he'd never actually trained against, and that there was a difference between the two, an important one worth remembering. And then, apparently, he just left. Without waiting for a response, without needing one, like he'd simply been passing along a piece of information he thought might be useful, rather than delivering some grand lesson about humility. I think about that a lot, honestly, more than I think about the fight itself. Because the fight was impressive, certainly, the kind of thing you'd pay good currency to watch again. But that quiet little exchange in an empty medical corridor, with no crowd, no stakes, nothing to gain from it, that told me something the fight never could have. It told me that Finch hadn't done any of this because he needed to prove a point about human capability. He'd done it because he'd been placed in a fight he didn't choose, handled it the way you handle a chore you'd rather not be doing, and then walked away without carrying any of it with him afterward, not even the satisfaction of victory, let alone any lingering resentment toward the creature that had tried to kill him 20 minutes earlier. Professor Kroon never mentioned this part in any of his follow-up lectures, for obvious reasons, since it rather undermines the narrative he was desperately trying to construct about controlled pedagogical outcomes. But Nirel heard about it eventually too, and she told me it was the piece of the whole event that convinced her fastest to change her academic focus, because a species capable of that kind of restraint after that kind of violence was a species worth understanding properly, not just fearing from a safe distance in a lecture hall. Kesran, for his part, apparently never told anyone what was said to him in that corridor. He simply changed, quietly, over the following months, from someone who bragged about hunts to someone who trained harder and talked considerably less. I don't know if that was humility or something closer to respect, possibly both, possibly something in between that doesn't have a clean word for it in any language I speak. And that, I think, is really the ending of this story, more than the fight itself ever was. Not the broken arm, not the silence in the stands, Not even the joke about his little sister on the way out the door. Just a quiet corridor, an empty medical bay, and a species we thought we understood turning out to be far more complicated and far more decent than any of us had bothered to imagine. We really thought that species was the weak one. We really truly did not have the first idea what we were talking about.